The winter morning of January 5, 1942, brought with it the sweet taste of victory to the streets of Tokyo. Exultant shouts echoed through the capital as citizens celebrated their nation's stunning military achievements across the Pacific. Yet aboard the flagship Yamato, anchored in the gray waters off Japan's coast, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto felt no such euphoria. The architect of Pearl Harbor sat in contemplative silence, studying intelligence reports that painted a picture of Japanese triumph stretching from the Philippines to Malaya and points south. Yamamoto understood better than most that these early victories, spectacular though they were, represented only the beginning of a much longer and more perilous journey. As he instructed his chief of staff, Admiral Matomi Ugaki, to begin preparations for the second stage of Pacific operations, the admiral's weathered face betrayed the weight of his concerns. He wanted detailed plans completed by mid-February, but not because he shared the boundless optimism of his countrymen. The speed of Japanese conquest had indeed astounded military planners in Tokyo, creating sharp divisions within the Imperial General Staff. The ardent military nationalists, drunk on success, pressed for continued expansion regardless of how far afield such ambitions might lead. They saw in Japan's string of victories proof of their nation's destiny to dominate Asia and the Pacific. Every conquered territory, every sunk battleship, every surrendered garrison seemed to validate their belief in Japanese invincibility. But Yamamoto belonged to a different school of thought entirely. The admiral had been among those less than enthusiastic about opening hostilities with the United States and Britain in the first place. His opposition to unlimited warfare had made him enemies among Tokyo's political elite, and friends within the Imperial General Staff had urged him to remain at sea aboard the combined fleet flagship, fearing assassination attempts if he lingered too long in the capital. Even now, surrounded by the trappings of naval success, Yamamoto's opinions remained an open secret among his staff. Admiral Ugaki frequently recorded in his diary the need for what he termed far-sighted statesmanship following their first month of glorious victories, words that echoed Yamamoto's own warnings about Japan's inability to sustain a prolonged war against the Western powers. The admiral's criticism extended beyond military strategy to the politicians themselves, particularly Prince Kono and others who seemed to lack any coherent vision for how Japan should conduct its Pacific campaign. 3 months before Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto had met with his old friend Ryoichi Sasakawa, president of the ultra-nationalist Kakusui-Do organization, at the Imperial Navy Club in Shiba. During that prescient conversation, Yamamoto had warned that war was inevitable given the politicians' decisions, but he had also offered a stark assessment of Japan's prospects. "At first, we'll have everything our own way," he had told Sasakawa, stretching out like an octopus spreading its tentacles. Now, just 1 month after the war's commencement, that octopus was indeed spread almost flat across the Pacific, its reach extending from Hawaii to the Dutch East Indies. Japanese forces controlled vast swaths of territory that had seemed unassailable just months before. Yet Yamamoto had also warned his friend that such euphoria could not last. The time for political action, he believed, would come at the moment Singapore fell, a disaster that would unsettle the British position in India and make them willing to listen to peace overtures. Yamamoto knew the British well from his service as a member of Japanese delegations to the London naval conferences of 1930 and 1934. He also understood Americans intimately, having served as Japanese naval attaché in Washington from 1926 to 1928. This intimate knowledge of Japan's enemies informed Yamamoto's strategic thinking. While he agreed that the politicians' decision to start the war necessitated winning a major victory quickly, he believed Japan would have only a year and a half to bask in glory before reality intruded. "We must get a peace agreement by then," he had told Sasakawa, looking to his old friend to carry this message to the right-wing political leaders then in power. By January 5th, that victory seemed tantalizingly close. The American battleship fleet lay crippled at Pearl Harbor following the December 7 attack. British naval power in the Pacific had suffered devastating blows with the sinking of the battleships HMS Repulse and HMS Prince of Wales off the Malay coast. In the Philippines, Manila had fallen and the United States naval base at Cavite had been captured. British forces had surrendered at Hong Kong, while Japanese troops were already preparing new landings in the Dutch East Indies, at Rabaul on New Ireland, Ambon, and throughout the Solomon Islands. However, the Pearl Harbor attack had not accomplished everything Yamamoto had hoped for. The destruction of major elements of the United States fleet remained incomplete. Most critically, the aircraft carriers that had been at sea during the attack remained unharmed and represented a constant, growing threat to Japanese operations. What was needed now was a spectacular achievement, and Yamamoto did not expect Singapore to fall for another 5 or 6 months. When it did fall on February 15th, he believed that if he was to achieve his goal of setting the stage for negotiation, he must move in another direction entirely. The question confronting Yamamoto's planners was where to strike next in this vast Pacific theater. The admiral had initially favored attacking the Soviet Union, but the Army quickly vetoed this suggestion. Such a campaign would be fought almost entirely on land, and the Army was already heavily committed in China and Southeast Asia, with insufficient reserves for another major front. This left 3 primary options for continued naval operations. Yamamoto's personal favorite involved a bold thrust into the Indian Ocean, an invasion of Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, that would draw out the British Far Eastern Fleet for destruction, much as he had destroyed American ships at Pearl Harbor. Following this naval victory, Japanese forces could push into the Middle East to link up with German force driving towards Soviet oil fields in the Caucasus. Such a strategy would assure the Japanese Navy of all the oil it needed for sustained operations. The Army refused to consider such a Middle Eastern operation, leaving only 2 viable plans. The first, advocated by the Naval General Staff in Tokyo, called for an attack on Australia to deprive the Americans of their forward base of operations. After securing the Solomon Islands, the Navy would capture New Guinea, New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa. Advocates of this plan at Imperial General Headquarters were already establishing occupation systems for both Australia and New Zealand, confident in their ability to bring the entire South Pacific under Japanese control. Yamamoto, however, disliked the Australia plan because he believed it would take too long and still would not be spectacular enough to halt American resistance. The admiral understood that the Pearl Harbor attack had aroused a spirit of vengeance among a people the Japanese had underestimated as soft and incompetent. The Army had dismissed Americans as too soft to fight a war to the finish, but mounting evidence suggested this assessment was dangerously wrong. It was becoming apparent that even the capture of Singapore would not stop American determination to continue the fight. What Yamamoto wanted was a victory so decisive it would make it possible for Japan to extend a generous olive branch and negotiate from a position of unassailable strength. In January, he ordered another plan drawn up, and 2 months later sent officers to Tokyo with 2 detailed proposals. The first was the Me Plan, which envisioned a climactic battle off Midway Island where the American carrier force would be destroyed once and for all. The second was the Owl Plan, detailing an invasion of the North American continent via Alaska. If all went according to Yamamoto's vision, Hawaii would eventually be occupied, and perhaps even the American West Coast. At minimum, victories at Midway and in the Aleutians would give Japanese politicians the foundation they needed to negotiate the sort of peace that Yamamoto hoped to achieve. In Tokyo, admirals quarreled around conference tables in the Navy Ministry, but in the end, Yamamoto's prestige and determination carried the day. Forgotten in these grand strategic deliberations was the potential significance of Singapore's fall in February and the impending collapse of Bataan and Corregidor, either of which might have served Yamamoto's diplomatic purposes. The reason these victories were no longer considered sufficient lay in a single, shocking event that changed the entire strategic calculus. Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle's B-25 bomber squadron raid on Tokyo in April. The Doolittle raid accomplished far more than its modest material damage might suggest. It shocked the Japanese into realizing that Americans were not the demoralized, defeated enemy they had imagined, but rather a people only beginning to fight. The psychological impact in Tokyo was enormous. If American bombers could reach the Japanese home islands, no place in the empire was truly safe. In June, Yamamoto's Midway operation flamed into disaster for Japan, though there was no team for recrimination afterward. Indeed, the army was not even informed of the full extent of the defeat. News of the destruction of 4 major fleet carriers was carefully suppressed, known only at the highest levels of the Navy. This secrecy would have profound implications for subsequent operations, as Army planners continued to base their strategies on the assumption that Japanese naval aviation remained at full strength. While Yamamoto had been off on his Midway excursion, the Naval General Staff in Tokyo had steadily moved Navy and Air Forces southward to prepare for the forthcoming attempt to cut off Australia from American support. Naval forces had captured Rabaul on January 23rd, and from that strategic base had conducted constant air reconnaissance and bombing raids against other islands throughout the region and New Guinea. The threat was apparent to Australian commanders, who communicated their concerns to General Douglas MacArthur following his arrival in March. If the Japanese were successful in taking New Guinea, it would be very nearly a walkover for them to capture northern Australia. The danger was immediate and growing. In February, Japanese forces had already bombed Darwin, and in March, when they invaded Salamaua in New Guinea, the pace of operations stepped up dramatically. In May, just before the Midway battle, Japanese forces had sent an occupation force toward Port Moresby, but it was turned back by fierce American and Australian defense in the carrier battle of the Coral Sea. However, the Japanese did succeed in occupying Tulagi, north of Guadalcanal, where they built a seaplane base that would prove strategically significant. The Battle of the Coral Sea convinced planners in Washington and Australia that they had to prepare for an even larger Japanese offensive in South Pacific. MacArthur informed the Australian government that it must be ready for a major attack before any Japanese thrust against India. He urgently cabled General George Marshall for 2 aircraft carriers and 1,000 planes, but in Washington that May, Admiral Ernest J. King, Chief of Naval Operations, informed Marshall that until the end of June, he would have only 2 working carriers in the entire Pacific theater. This was in stark contrast to the Japanese, who on the eve of Midway possessed 10 operational carriers, giving them an enormous advantage in mobile air power. Pacific Fleet Commander Admiral Chester W. Nimitz had already given advanced warning about the major Japanese offensive he expected, which turned out to be the Midway battle. While those dramatic events unfolded in the Central Pacific, the Japanese were quietly establishing their forces in the New Guinea Solomons area for renewed southern operations. Major General Tomitaro Hori landed the South Seas Force at Salamaua, while naval troops occupied Lae and began constructing an airbase there. Operating independently of Admiral Yamamoto's Midway plans, the Imperial General Staff had authorized the Port Moresby operation, and Lieutenant General Harukichi Hute was ordered to press on toward New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa, and to be ready to resume the advance against Port Moresby by July. This timeline assumed that the Midway battle would be successful and that Admiral Yamamoto's combined fleet would return to protect these southern operations with its powerful carrier force. In spite of the crushing defeat at Midway, which was reported to field forces as a victory, Imperial General Headquarters did not alter these ambitious plans. A few days after Midway, Australian intelligence informed General MacArthur that Japanese forces were prepared to resume major offensive operations. In view of what appeared to be a Japanese victory at Midway, MacArthur suggested that the Allies should launch a preemptive attack on the New Britain-New Ireland area, followed by an assault on Rabaul, the main Japanese naval and air base in the region. MacArthur's plan was ambitious, calling for 2 aircraft carriers, 1,000 planes, and an amphibious division to force the Japanese back to Truk. On June 12th, General Marshall presented the MacArthur Plan to Admiral King with some modifications. He wanted 3 carriers instead of 2, plus 1 Marine division and 3 Army divisions to conduct the assaults. Admiral King opposed the idea primarily because it would place MacArthur in overall command of the operation. King's other objections were more tactical. The carriers would be subject to land-based air attack and would not have sufficient protection. As events would prove at Guadalcanal, the Navy would indeed have to cope with both of these problems. King devised his own alternative plan, a drive from the New Hebrides by forces under Navy command. MacArthur naturally objected to having his Army forces serve under Navy command, but nobody could deny the necessity of stopping the Japanese before they completed their conquest of New Guinea and positioned themselves to attack Australia. The problem for the Joint Chiefs of Staff was determining unified command arrangements for such a complex operation. The solution they reached divided the offensive into phases. The Joint Chiefs gave Phase 1 the primary task of taking the Santa Cruz Islands, Tulagi, and adjacent positions to Admiral King's naval forces. Guadalcanal was initially just a spot on the map with no known tactical or strategic value, and did not even merit a specific mention in the original JCS planning documents. General MacArthur was offered a consolation prize. After Phase 1, he was to take over and eliminate remaining Japanese forces in the Solomons, Rabaul, and New Guinea. Admiral King prevailed because the Joint Chiefs recognized that he had already planned a defensive line across the Pacific to protect Australia, and his plan would require relatively fewer forces than MacArthur's more ambitious scheme. Thousands of troops were already training in New Caledonia, and King had convinced General Henry Hap Arnold to send several squadrons of United States Army Air Force planes there. He had also reinforced Samoa and Efate in the New Hebrides, and planned to establish a base in Tonga. Admiral Wilson Brown, whose indecisiveness during the Wake Island crisis had earned King's displeasure, was transferred to a newly established unit called the Amphibious Training Command at San Diego. He and Marine Major General Holland Smith were tasked with developing new techniques for island warfare, skills that would prove essential in the campaigns to come. Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, King's chief plans officer, suggested that the first American effort must focus on holding the line in the South Pacific while training amphibious forces for offensive operations. The second stage would involve a combined offensive by the United States, Australia, and New Zealand through the Solomon Islands to the Bismarck Archipelago and the Admiralty Islands. The third stage would involve seizure of the Caroline and Marshall Islands, while the fourth stage would take Allied forces either to the Dutch East Indies or to the Philippines. Admiral King approved this comprehensive plan because it aligned with his own strategic vision. He made arrangements to bring Vice Admiral Robert L. Ghormley, who was serving as a naval observer in London, to head the South Pacific Command. King also detached Rear Admiral Turner from the Plans Division and ordered him to prepare for command of amphibious operations. These preparations were completed even before Japanese forces launched their assault on Port Moresby and occupied Tulagi. Vice Admiral Ghormley left Washington on May 1st, scheduled to take command of South Pacific forces on June 19th. But first he had to report to Admiral Nimitz at Pearl Harbor, who would be his direct superior. By the time Ghormley reached Pearl Harbor, Japanese offensive operations were already accelerating in South Pacific. On May 22nd, an Army reconnaissance plane spotted a Japanese photo reconnaissance aircraft taking pictures of Guadalcanal. Army intelligence suggested that the Japanese were preparing to construct an airfield there, an assessment that would prove remarkably prescient. On June 25th, Army intelligence reported that grass on the island's central plain had been burned off and tents had appeared in the area. A wharf was under construction at Lunga Point. 6 days later, an Australian coast watcher on Guadalcanal reported that airfield construction was proceeding rapidly, awaiting online the arrival of Japanese construction units. He even identified the specific units involved, the 11th and 13th Pioneer Forces, equivalent to American CB construction battalion units. This crucial intelligence was confirmed by radio interception at Pearl Harbor. The Pacific Fleet's Radio Intelligence Group, which had broken portions of the Japanese naval code, intercepted a message indicating that the 11th and 13th Pioneer Forces would arrive at their destination on July 4th. Fleet intelligence officers connected the dots immediately. Admiral Turner happened to be visiting Pearl Harbor that day, en route to prepare for amphibious operations somewhere in the South Pacific. When Admiral Nimitz received the radio intelligence report, Turner realized exactly where he was heading. It could be nowhere but the Solomons. Within 2 weeks of this intelligence breakthrough, Turner was in Wellington, where he boarded his flagship, the USS Macaulay, a converted Grace Line passenger ship formerly known as the Santa Barbara. His seemingly impossible task was to train an entire amphibious task force in just 1 month, transforming raw troops into an invasion force capable of conducting America's first offensive operation of the Pacific War. As Turner frantically moved ships and personnel around New Zealand ports, Admiral Ghormley traveled to Melbourne to confer with General MacArthur. Ghormley left New Zealand with serious doubts about the wisdom of attempting such a complex amphibious operation when virtually no one in the American military knew how to conduct one properly. MacArthur, who had his own reasons for disliking the plan, primarily because it placed naval forces rather than his own command in the leading role, agreed entirely with Ghormley's pessimistic assessment. Both commanders also concurred that with available aircraft, they could not guarantee sufficient air coverage for the landing forces. This meeting occurred in July 8th, with landing scheduled in just 3 weeks. The two commanders sent a joint dispatch to Washington recommending that the operation be deferred until proper resources could be assembled. Admiral King was decidedly unhappy with this message. He had warned his new South Pacific commander that he was handing him a difficult assignment and that proper tools might not be available until perhaps the fall. But the answer remained unchanged. The invasion would proceed as planned. Ghormley had left Washington convinced that the United States was not prepared for aggressive action in the South Pacific, and his gloom increased when he failed to secure CB units and other specialized forces for immediate deployment to New Zealand. From the beginning, the Guadalcanal invasion plan was notable for catastrophic failures of intelligence and preparation. All concerned commands understood that a major operation was imminent, particularly after July 10th, when Admiral Nimitz sent Admiral Ghormley his formal operations orders. Intelligence reports confirmed that the major Japanese airbase at Rabaul posed a deadly threat. Planes from those fields could refuel at Guadalcanal and then bomb Australia, potentially striking devastating blows at Allied buildup efforts throughout the region. However, on July 10th, Allied intelligence services reports reaching King contained only casual comments about airfield construction at Guadalcanal. A few days later, reconnaissance reports located the airfield on the wrong side of the island entirely. By the end of July, Japanese forces had completed their airfield construction, and at combined fleet headquarters in Japan, Admiral Yamamoto gave orders for the first staged mission to departure ball on August 14th. As commander of the overall United States operation, Admiral Ghormley tried desperately to secure additional resources to build advanced bases and deploy more aircraft. But everywhere he turned, he encountered the truth of Admiral King's warning that proper tools would not be available. The supply situation for invasion forces exemplified these problems. Equipment was loaded haphazardly aboard transports at Oakland. While there were plenty of docks available for systematic unloading and reloading supplies in order of intended use, ships were instead sent directly to Noumea, which lacked such facilities. Admiral King maintained at least a general understanding of these difficulties, but insisted there was no time for delay. King understood better than any of his subordinates the absolute necessity of stopping Japanese expansion before they reached Australia. The timetable remained fixed, and by late July, the urgent rush was on as 17,000 Marines moved by troop ship from California, Pearl Harbor, Noumea, and Samoa. Admiral Ghormley was too occupied with logistical challenges to convene a conference of his commanders. But on July 26th, Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, designated as tactical commander, called a meeting aboard his flagship, the carrier Saratoga. This marked the first time tactical unit commanders met to discuss the impending invasion. Admiral Fletcher's role was to protect the invasion with his carrier task force, while Admiral Turner would deliver the assault troops under Marine General Alexander Vandegrift. Once Marines secured the islands, garrison troops would be brought in to hold them permanently. The operation was planned with such haste that no provision had been made for reserve forces. There were simply no additional troops available in the South Pacific. The meeting aboard the Saratoga proved far from encouraging. Fletcher began by announcing that he would protect landings at Guadalcanal for only 2 days before withdrawing his carriers. He insisted, with concurrence from Ghormley's staff members present, that the carriers must not be risked in extended operations. Fletcher had been gun-shy since the Coral Sea battle, where he had lost the carrier USS Lexington, and his caution bordered on timidity. One participant would later write that Fletcher announced the whole operation wascakied, hasty, and doomed. Admiral Turner, who possessed a better understanding of the global military situation than any other officer in the room, chided his superior. There was no point in such defeatist arguments. He declared the decision had been made to accept all risks, and their job was to carry out orders regardless of personal reservations. Fletcher should have understood these realities after the Coral Sea experience. Admiral King had been so displeased with Fletcher's constant avoidance of decisive action that he had insisted Admiral Nimitz personally assess Fletcher's fighting spirit. Nimitz, a kindly man who liked Fletcher personally, had given the carrier commander an encouraging talk, and when the Battle of Midway was won with Fletcher in tactical command, his reputation seemed restored. However, on the eve of America's first offensive operation, warning troops and support ships that he intended to abandon them within 48 hours represented an inauspicious beginning to the campaign. The rehearsal for the Guadalcanal invasion was conducted on July 28th and lasted 3 days. The location was Coral Island near Fiji, chosen for its similarity to the target area. The exercise proved to be what General Vandegrift later characterized as a complete bust. Only 1/3 of the assigned troops managed to get ashore during the practice landings, and when they did reach the beach, they had no clear understanding of their objectives or procedures. There was no time for second-guessing or additional training. On July 31st, Marines were back aboard their transports, heading for Guadalcanal and their appointment with history. On the afternoon of August 6th, as the task force of 75 ships approached the Solomons, Admiral Fletcher nervously broke away with his carriers. He would position his aircraft over the landing force as promised, but the 26 ships of the carrier group would be kept as far from potential harm as possible. If American intelligence had been faulty enough to permit the Japanese buildup of an airfield at Guadalcanal, Japanese intelligence proved even more inadequate. As the United States invasion fleet massed in the South Pacific, Japanese commanders had no inkling of the forthcoming attack. In July 1942, the Japanese army was preoccupied with capturing New Guinea as a staging point for operations against Australia and New Zealand. Major General Hori's South Seas Force had landed 2,000 troops near Buna, and after capturing that location, Japanese forces planned to construct airfields there as a prelude to renewed assault on Port Moresby. Japanese air power was concentrated against Port Moresby throughout Chile, with bombers and fighters sweeping over ports and airfields almost daily. Following the Japanese landings at Buna, air forces were also called upon to support the beachhead, and in early August, their attention remained fixed on this new offensive. Combined Australian and American air forces responded with raids on Japanese air bases at Lae, creating the impression that ground operations in New Guinea represented the primary focus of Allied activity in the region. During these preparations, Admiral Yamamoto's flagship Yamato remained anchored at Hashirajima in Japanese waters. In leisurely fashion, he was planning forthcoming air operations over Australia, considering what actions might be taken next in his broader strategic vision. In preparation for renewed southern operations, on August 3rd, naval air groups stationed at Ley were brought back to Rabaul to support the Guadalcanal operations scheduled to begin the following week. During the first week of August, South Pacific skies were cloudy, and only a handful of Japanese search planes managed to take flight. None of them discovered the massive American armada steaming toward Guadalcanal. Japanese airmen flying out of Rabaul were surprised to encounter American carrier aircraft in skies around Buna. They had been told that United States carriers were destroyed at Midway. The confused pilots assumed that the carriers they encountered were operating with Australian forces that had somehow marched across the Owen Stanley Mountains. In reality, these were American aircraft conducting final training exercises for the Guadalcanal invasion. No one in the Imperial High Command or in Field Command suspected a major amphibious invasion was imminent. After 8 months of continuous victories, it was psychologically difficult for Japanese commanders to believe that the Allies could launch a seaborne invasion of any significant scale. Had the idea been suggested, they would have agreed with General MacArthur and Admiral Ghormley that such an invasion possessed almost no chance of success. As the American Expeditionary Force moved toward Guadalcanal, it enjoyed complete strategic surprise. On August 4th and 5, the 75 ships steamed forward under an overcast sky, and on August 6th, the fleet moved through rain squalls almost all day long. But as dawn rose on the morning of August 7th, skies cleared dramatically, ensuring that carrier planes would have excellent visibility for their attacks. The fleet went to general quarters at 5:30 a.m., and at 6 o'clock, carriers launched their first strikes. Aircraft from USS Wasp, USS Saratoga, and USS Enterprise were assigned targets on Guadalcanal, Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo. The Japanese had established a seaplane base on Gavutu and Tanambogo, connected by a causeway, but Japanese aircraft had been grounded the previous day by severe weather. Admiral Fletcher's task force reported only one unidentified aircraft during August 6th, and whether it was Japanese or an aircraft from General MacArthur's command remained undetermined. In any event, Japanese forces were not alerted to the impending assault until 6:12 a.m. on August 7th, when communications headquarters at the Tulagi seaplane base sent a frantic message announcing the attack. The radio message reached the 4th, 6th, and 8th Fleets, Admiral Yamamoto personally, and Imperial headquarters. It was simple and succinct. Enemy heavy bombardment in progress. Weather had cleared, and carrier planes flew off into scattered cumulus clouds illuminated by a quarter moon. Fighters and bombers departed on their appointed missions with deadly efficiency. 8 fighters led by Lieutenant L.H. Bauer took off from USS Enterprise to attack Guadalcanal's aircraft, PT boats, troop installations, and supply dumps. They found no aircraft and no PT boats, but they did strafe buildings at the airfield near Lunga Point. Meanwhile, another 8 fighters from Enterprise maintained combat air patrol over transport areas from 6 o'clock until 8 a.m., when they were replaced by fresh aircraft. Bombers began hitting Tulagi and the Lunga Point area systematically, encountering no enemy air activity throughout the morning. Americans controlled the skies completely, with the only aircraft damage being those hurt in operational accidents. Planes from other carriers struck the seaplane base at Gavutu with devastating effect. The surprise was so complete that American aircraft arrived and began bombing and strafing seaplanes still moored in the water. They destroyed 9 float planes, similar to the Zero, 1 4-engine Kawanishi flying boat, and 8 seaplanes that served dual roles as reconnaissance aircraft and bombers. A few Japanese pilots attempted to take off, but were shot down before becoming airborne. Not a single Japanese aircraft at Gavutu survived the coordinated attack. Other carrier planes struck Japan troop concentrations on Tulagi and hit targets along beaches that Marines would soon assault. Before dawn, Marines crowded on transport decks could see the high mountains of islands that represented their objectives. Transports slipped through the narrow passage between Guadalcanal and Savo Islands into what would become known as Ceylon Channel. As dawn broke, guns from escorting warships opened fire, and muzzle flashes illuminated the entire fleet. There was virtually no answering fire from Japanese positions. The bombardment from cruisers and destroyers accompanying troopships started fires along the shoreline, and an oil dump exploded, sending flames leaping dramatically into the pre-dawn sky. At 8 a.m., after 2 hours of bombing and shelling, landing craft began moving toward the north shore east of Lunga Point. Marines were understandably nervous. Neither they nor their officers possessed any practical experience in such complex amphibious operations. This represented the first American amphibious invasion since the Spanish-American War more than 4 decades earlier. At 9 a.m., troops began landing on Guadalcanal, meeting absolutely no resistance because Japanese defenders had fled into the hills. The initial advance proved ridiculously easy for American forces. Marines soon discovered how completely they had surprised their enemies when they encountered wooden barracks that had never been occupied and found a tent containing a breakfast table laden with platters and bowls of meat, rice, and cooked plums. Half-filled rice bowls were scattered around the area, with chopsticks hastily dropped on tables or straw mats covering the floor. The tents themselves revealed why Japanese forces had departed so rapidly. They were torn by shrapnel, and some had been flattened entirely by naval bombardment preceding the landings. However, any Marine tempted to celebrate the ease of their early objectives had serious shocks awaiting them on nearby islands. While Japanese defenders on Guadalcanal had been surprised and were primarily construction troops rather than combat soldiers who had not yet established permanent fortifications, the situation at Tulagi proved dramatically different. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson's 1st Marine Raider Battalion and the 5th Battalion of the 2nd Marines encountered fierce, determined resistance from approximately 250 Japanese troops stationed on this smaller island. The Japanese defenders were soldiers of the Yokohama Air Base Detachment under Captain Shigetoshi Miyazaki, experienced and thoroughly dedicated fighters who had prepared their positions carefully. Edson's 1st Raiders represented the toughest American troops in the Pacific Theater, all volunteers selected from the ranks of a force already renowned for its fighting qualities. The Raider concept had originated from Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson's recommendation for a Kriatinga commando force. Carlson's unique experience included several months of service with the Chinese Communist 8th Route Army during its guerrilla campaign against Japanese forces in North China. Edson's Raiders had trained for many months under Spartan conditions, and when they arrived at Guadalcanal, they possessed a formidable reputation that they would need to validate against seasoned opponents. This invasion marked the first direct contact between highly trained American troops and veteran Japanese soldiers since the war began in December. The Japanese military had developed a reputation of being more fearsome than that of the Raider battalions through their phenomenally rapid conquest of the Philippines, Malaya, and the East Indies. For months, Tokyo had celebrated these victories, and much of the world had come to believe Japanese forces were genuinely invincible, a reputation the Imperial High Command was pleased to encourage. Tulagi thus represented a crucial testing ground for both forces. Edson's troops landed at 8:15 a.m. on the northwestern portion of the island, and initially the advance did not appear much more difficult than operations on Guadalcanal. They encountered resistance from scattered outposts, but the northwest section of Tulagi was covered with thick jungle, small trees, vines, and bougainvillea with beautiful leaves and dangerously sharp thorns. Initially, terrain seemed to pose the worst obstacle. Edson lost only one man, killed by a sniper, as Marines hit the beach. Edson planned to move inland to a ridge running the length of the island, then work along the ridgetop, clearing slopes as they advanced southward. However, the terrain proved so difficult that it required 3 hours for his men to hack their way along just 1.5 miles of rising ground. Having reached the ridgeline, Marines moved forward, emerged from thick jungle and encountered the central Japanese defense positions built on the hillside. Japanese engineers had constructed elaborate dugouts and rock emplacements, positioning machine guns carefully to create interlocking fields of fire. The Japanese defensive strategy was based on maintaining positions above attacking forces, but Marines discovered that by crawling up cliffs, they could drop dynamite charges and grenades into dugouts. This became their primary method of advancement. Even after a dugout was destroyed, it remained dangerous. In one excavation, Americans killed 17 Japanese soldiers with dynamite charges. When non-Marines spotted a radio inside and entered to retrieve it, 2 Japanese soldiers who had survived the explosion shot him and another man who came to assist before being killed themselves.